Ms. Miriam. I'm a crop production specialist with MAFCA. I'm relatively new to Maine and relatively new to MAFCA, just started in August. I'll give you a little bit more information about me as we move forward, but feel free to drop some questions in the chat as I'm giving presentation. I would love it if this felt really interactive for you all, so we could get kind of what everybody is hoping to get out of it. In that spirit, I'm also going to launch a poll right now. So if anybody who is on their computer can answer the poll, that would be great. I'm just curious kind of where everybody lies in their experience with gardening. It would be helpful to kind of know where you're all coming from. We got a nice mix coming in. While you all are answering that, I'll just start off by sharing my screen. All right, so we've got about an even split between the first three categories here. First ever garden, growing for a year or two, and growing for a few years. And then a few of you have been growing for decades. And we'd love to welcome your expertise here too in the conversation. So feel free to add detail to the chat and share what you know. Gardening is a community experience. It's kind of the best part of it, if you can figure out how to build a community around it. So to start off this presentation, I just want to acknowledge that we are on unceded territory belonging to the Wabanaki Confederation. I encourage you to find this website, Native Land, and learn more about specifically what people's land you are living on. You can really find out a lot more detail through that website. So just a quick, for those of you who do not know what MAFCA is, to give you a little bit of an overview. MAFCA is a Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association. There are two arms of MAFCA. I work with the nonprofit arm, as does Anna here. And what we provide is technical support to farmers, including beginning farmers, and that's kind of the role that I step in at MAFCA with. We also work in community education, which is Anna's role here. We do a lot of advocacy at the state and national levels, coordinate a lot of membership in this larger community of organic farmers and gardeners, and coordinate a lot of shared community work through volunteerism, and of course run the Common Ground Country Fair. There's also a certification service that is a separate LLC. So we do communicate with them, but just for clarity's sake, because I find that this is a misconception, we are somewhat separate from that certificate, from the certifying arm of MAFCA. And who am I? What am I doing here? So I'm coming to Maine after finishing my PhD in entomology and international ag and development. Crop specialist, but I've also been a gardener for a long time, and I've been building in a lot of the sort of academic learning and farm work that I've done over the years into the way that I've gardened. But I'm also a renter, and so I've learned how to garden in a lot of different contexts, and that's part of why I'm really excited to talk to you all today, because I think if you have questions like, I don't have space with sunlight, I have a few answers for you. Because I've gardened without sunlight, and I've gardened in raised beds and in containers and in community gardens, kind of all over the Northeast. So if you're thinking about ways to be creative with the space that you do have, I'd love to be able to help share that. I also wanted to share with you just why I garden. It's important to me because it helps get me outside as a way to make all of these spaces that aren't really mine feel more like home. It's been really important as a way to find access to growing foods that are culturally important to my family and are kind of hard to get in the US. It's important to me because I love showing and sharing what I've grown with others and creating beauty with those gardens. And it also just feels like a really important way to honor the privilege that I do have in being able to garden at all. And it's a way to exercise radical control over my little tiny corner of the food system that I exist in. So there's a lot of different reasons that we all come to gardening. And I think it's important that we focus in on those while we ask questions about how to start one. I also think it's important to define a garden, because I think often this gets narrowed, but actually gardening is really, really broad, and a lot of people do gardening in a lot of different fun, cool, weird ways. But a garden is really just any place where you're growing herbs, fruits, flowers, vegetables, anything, and it's usually in dirt or soil, but not always. And if you can fit within those parameters, like those are big parameters. So there's a lot of different kinds of gardens that might erupt out of these new gardens that are here today. And again, think about why you're gardening as we go through this presentation, and let that help you make decisions about your plans for your garden. What is organic gardening specifically? Just also want to drill down into that, because there is a little bit of a difference between the practices and the certification. So this is really not focusing on what the certification standards are. We'll talk a little bit about what products are labeled as organic, because that's important for you if you really want to be sticking to those metrics, to be purchasing things that are organic certified when you're putting inputs into your garden. But your practices are a little bit different from that. What we're really coming into is sort of a set of values of how we approach gardening, that we use holistic and more strategic approaches to be working with the natural world to manage our gardens instead of working against it. And then in that, trying to remember that plants are not things and soil is not stuff. Plants are living beings that are rooted in soil, and soil is a rich and really dynamic community of living beings that's in a specific environment. And as we make decisions of how to care for a garden, it's really important to keep both of those things in mind to help it thrive. So the way that I'm going to talk through these slides is just how do you start a garden is kind of where I'm going to begin. And then what are some things that we can do to manage that garden in an organic way? The slides are kind of simplistic for the most part. So there's a few opportunities to really be using the chat function here to add depth to our conversation and make it a little bit more specific. But I'm not sure that I can see the chat at the moment.
I'm keeping an eye on it. Miriam, I can now feed some questions up to you.
So yeah, and I'll keep an eye on it for us. And yeah, please feel free to use the chat so we can guide that conversation so that you all get what you need to get out of this. From getting started, there's sort of like three big questions that we see a lot. One is, where should I be growing my garden? The other is, what should I be growing in it, and how much of that? And I encourage everyone to take a really holistic view of that too. So the first question that you need to address is sort of, where are you going to garden? And ideally, a garden site obviously is going to have great sunlight. You're going to look for the place where you have the most access. You're going to look for fertile, well-drained soil. Now, this time of the season is like a really perfect time to start looking for standing water and whether you're going to have drainage problems. You're going to look for a space that has enough space for the amount of gardening you think you want to do, not just now, but maybe in the future. And you want to look for a space that's accessible and convenient, and think about things like, you're going to need to water that garden. Is there water access that you can reach to? You might need to be lugging bags of compost into that garden. Are you going to have an easy pathway to do that? So think about some of those logistics in the long run too, as you're finding a place. That all being said, what if you don't have a space that meets all of these criteria? There's a ton of ways to be gardening outside of that. If you don't have enough sunlight, you can focus in on plants, for example, that don't need as much to thrive, or even require a lot less in order to thrive. That's often leafy plants that burn very easily, that do well in a little bit less sunlight. You can also garden in containers that you can move through the day to chase the sun. That is why I container gardened, not this previous summer, not only to chase the sun, but to chase me while I moved. So I brought an entire container garden with me on a 9-hour moving trip. So there's a lot of opportunity to make what garden space is much more flexible with your needs, and you can get really creative with that. And I'm sure that some of the more experienced gardeners have some ideas of things that have worked for them. I was just going to get to that. If you are struggling, I see Sean's question, how much does site drainage matter when gardening in raised beds? If you can't find a place with good drainage, raised beds are kind of what I would suggest as your next step forward. Raised beds and containers. So lift it up out of the ground if you know that you're not going to be able to find a good spot with drainage. But if you are really struggling with drainage, definitely think about adding some extra height to that raised bed. Similarly, if you don't have enough space, find ways to be creative. Trellis things that you didn't think were trellisable. Way more plants can be trellised and pushed to vertical heights than you think. So you can use your vertical space instead of horizontal. Focus on smaller plants, focus on plants with really quick time to maturity so that you're able to really swap out and use that space highly efficiently and get all of the crop you can out of it in these short summers of Maine. I know this is a joke of site selection in this economy, but it is important to think about this, whether or not you have access to these spaces. If you do have access to these spaces, there's also opportunities for you to find ways to be supportive of the community members around you that don't. So one thing to think about is how can you support your local community garden, even if it's not something that you need access to. So definitely look into that if that's a privilege that you have and you'd love to share. So what to grow? People ask me this all the time. What will be easiest? What will be most successful? Whatever is going to be easiest is going to be whatever you like the most. I am terrible at growing radishes. I will never be successful at growing radishes because I actually don't like eating radishes. So I don't think about them. I don't care about them. So they are consistently going to die on me. And I've been doing this for a long time. And technically, could I grow a radish? Yes, but I don't have the attention span for them. Pick what you love. You're going to find time for that. And really narrow in, especially when you're first starting out in a garden, on the few things that you know you're going to love and you're going to find joy in seeing them grow every day. So think about aesthetics. Aesthetics are a great reason to pick a plant to grow. You'll give it more attention. And you know, these spaces are precious. And so sometimes I do pick even vegetables based on how cute they are. There are just some cute vegetables that I'd love to live with. And that's a great reason to pick one too, because again, you're going to give it more love and attention and it's going to thrive a lot more. The joy of the hobby is really important to think about too. This is not something you have to do, so don't make it painful. If you don't like harvesting zucchini because you don't like wearing long sleeves and getting scratched up, don't grow zucchini. Don't grow anything you don't enjoy taking care of or harvesting. That's fine. Just skip it. Find the things that bring you some joy. And then you do also have to fold in the practical, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but what do you have time and space to take care of, including the harvest? You know, there are some crops that all of that harvest is going to turn around really quick. Do you have daily time to be picking zucchini before they get too big and bitter? So think about these things as you're planning out your summer and your season. Do you got weddings to go to? Are you going to be gone for 2 weeks? Think about it. So those can be really important for pieces of information to plan out your garden as well. How much to grow? So the first thing I'm going to say is this is a picture of my garden map for the year. I sketch this out every year. Every year I have to have a drawing because otherwise I know I'm going to get really excited and I'm going to grow way more than fits in the garden. And halfway through the season, everything's going to start to fail. You have to pay attention to spacing. You have to pay attention to timing. And so a map can be really, really important for your planning. So I really encourage you to start there. When you are first starting, start super, super small and expand way more slowly than you think you need to, because there is nothing as heartbreaking as taking on too much and watching a plant go because you just don't have it in you this year. Definitely start with just a few things that you know aren't going to be a challenge in your context. And by your context, I mean your time, your space, your environment, what plants are going to do well in the practical sense, and what do you actually enjoy. Don't take on challenges day one. That's actually good advice for most things. Start with some quick growing plants so that if things don't go well, you've got another chance in a week. Lettuces, they're fantastic for that. You know, if they all kind of crap out on you, replant, try again. It's a great way to start learning. Make a plan, make a plan, make a plan. I'll bring it up 1,000 times. Make a plan. Where's your plan? And plan your expansions as well ahead of time. So think about what is your plan going to be, not just for this season, but the next 3. And think about how that's going to fit into some of your other choices. In terms of how much to grow, also think about how much you can eat or give away. Be a little bit reasonable about that. There is nobody that I know that can actually manage in a smallish family 2 cherry tomato plants if they're doing okay. It's going to overwhelm you. Think about your tomatoes. When you are planning on figuring out how to get everything planted, remember to consider what is going to need to be transplanted and what will be direct seeded. And when do you need to do all of that? In all of that, something to think about is what plants do you want to start yourself? For me, there are some plants that I start myself because I know that the varieties are not going to be accessible to me otherwise, and I can find seed for them. Some of them I start myself because I think they're adorable when they're babies. But think about your setup. Think about if you want to put in the time and energy into seed starting. It can be much more frustrating and much more space, much bigger use of your home space. I seed started on the kitchen table this year. That went okay in the sense that it is completed, but difficult in the sense that there was a kitten rolling in dirt the whole time. This is Fester, my little helper. It's a monster. New to Maine climate. Is there enough time to grow pumpkins, melons, and squashes up here? Melons are going to be the toughest of those. There are certainly some squashes that grow very successfully, and certainly pumpkins that grow very successfully. Melons are often will require season extension structures in some way in order to be successful with getting all the way to a sweet fruit at the end, which is a bummer for me as well. I grew up in Maryland and I do have a cantaloupe addiction. So from here, I kind of want to transition into thinking about what the soil is. You know, I started off by reminding everybody that soil is this living community. So what does it mean to feed the soil and not the plant? What does it mean to focus in on the richness of the environment that you're offering to a plant? So just to remind you that, you know, there's a whole food web happening, not just above the ground that you can see, but below the ground as well. With microbial activity, there's bacteria, fungi, and even viruses that are all interacting with one another, and all of the decomposing organic matter that's in that soil, that's building like really rich dynamic activity. There's also smaller invertebrate animals living in the soil. There's nematodes, there's a ton of grubs, there's it's just a rich community down there in any healthy soil ecosystem. What we want to talk about when we're talking about feeding the soil is not just specifically adding direct amendments like fertilizer, lime, other things that might directly change the soil nutrition, but also indirectly feeding the soil by supporting that whole ecosystem that's going into life that's held within the soil that you are using. You'll hear a lot about people talking about their soil textures. Often what people will talk about when they talk about their soil textures is if they have clay, silt, sand, or loam. I'm putting up this chart just to let you know that there's a lot more complexity to that. And what it comes down to is you do need to learn the texture that you are working with. You don't necessarily need to learn the title of it, but you do need to get to know it. You need to touch it and play with it and experiment a little with different things that you can add to it and what the soil feels like after that. So soil texture for the home gardener should just be about knowing your soil environment really well and getting close with it. Soil fertility, similarly, I think is talked about in a really narrow way. It's talked about in terms of, is there nitrogen, is there phosphorus, is there potassium, and all of these other micronutrients. But the nutrition that's available in your soil is not just the numbers of these, like the numerical content of these different like nutritional items that plants can uptake. It's also about how available they are in the context of the whole soil ecosystem. So your soil structure is really important. If you are building a garden in a place that's been a pathway where people have walked for a really long time, that soil is going to be really, really compacted. It's going to be really difficult for roots to grow through the soil to reach any of those nutrients. If there's not enough organic matter in that soil, it might be impossible in the moment for it to support an ecosystem until you're able to nourish that soil again and give it enough life breathed into it again to be able to offer life to new plants. pH really matters, mostly that if your soil pH is generally too far outside the range of 6.5, a lot of those micronutrients around the circle become much less available for plants. So at a specific pH, it's very easy for the plants to pick them up. It's very difficult for them to pick them up and they get left in the soil if a soil becomes too acidic or too basic. So it is important to pay attention to some of these more like quantifiable numeric understandings of what soil is. But part of all of this richness comes in as well when we're talking about an ecosystem in the soil is microbial activity is really, really critical to not just what NPK is present in the soil, but how much of it is accessible by plants. So there are microbes digesting unavailable nitrogen and making it available to plants. But once it's available to plants, it also is available to be washed out of the soil very quickly. So is all of that timing happening in a way that's really supporting the plant's needs? Soil fertility, long story short, it is easier to amend the ecosystem in many ways than it is to amend these specific chemicals. What is organic matter? The real answer to this question is we have recently figured out as like a scientific community that maybe we don't know. We're using some metrics that seem correct, but what it actually is before you pull it into a lab is a big old question mark. We know it's decomposing living and dead things. We know that's where it comes from. We know what it does for the soil, but what the actual chemical makeup is of the thing that we are calling organic matter, this thing that makes soil sticky and rich and able to hang on to water and able to hang on to nutrients, question mark. Soil is a mystery. It's kind of magical. We can have all of this like really fancy science in the world and soil is eluding us. It's really important to think about building that organic matter because it just does so much for that richness of soil fertility. It can improve your soil structure, make it harder to make your soil really compacted. It can improve your water retention. So that's going to protect against flooding and drought at the same time. Fantastic benefit, given that we do not know what Maine will be like any given summer from here on out. And it just improves the way that that nutrition is accessible by plants. Some of the sources that you can get organic matter from are adding compost to your soil, adding manure, cover cropping, which we can talk about a little bit more later, mulch, and even seaweed is really common here. But in general, my big advice for making sure that you've got organic matter in your soil is just do not leave your soil bare whenever you can help it. A week or two here and there isn't going to make a huge difference depending on the season, but get it planted. And if you're not growing a garden, put in cover crops. Just cover the soil. Make sure that it's not just a patch of dirt, but a living ecosystem. So when you do need to add some specific nutrition to your garden, you do want to look for OMRI listed, this label for organic use. So that means that those amendments are approved for use in organic gardens and farms. Some of the typical options here are listed. For nitrogen, what I most often see is blood meal and feather meal. But you can also get a lot of solid amount of nitrogen out of compost and manure, some of the more like general additions that you might put in a garden. Phosphorus, there's a couple options as well. Potassium, there's a few options that are going to be OMRI listed, but the big thing to do is go into a garden center, look online at a website that's more focused on organic gardening, and look for that OMRI label when you need an amendment for your soil. Yes, so Heather just added, you can also use homeopathic remedies to balance soil, and it's very cheap. That is very true. It is also just a little bit more complex than I had time for to touch on today, but there's definitely a lot of really interesting work that's being done on some just cool, weird things that I hadn't known about until recently, and fermentation ideas and cool things like that. Definitely something to do some reading about if you're interested. How do you know if you need any of the things that we've talked about? You should get a soil test. You should definitely get a soil test if you have never tested the soil before. You partly want to check your first soil test because you need to know if your soil is contaminated with lead. That's especially true for those of you who are in urban or in suburban spaces. It's just a little bit more likely that there might be lead in your soil. Having lead in your soil and other contaminants in your soil does not mean that you cannot garden. In the same way that not having sunlight or having good drainage does not mean you cannot garden. It means that you have to mitigate the problem. So if you do have any kind of contaminants, for the most part, those recommendations are usually going to be to build a raised bed high enough that you're not really pulling too much from the soil that's below, and not growing so many root vegetables. So there's ways around any of it, but it's good to know and it's important to check. If you have been gardening in the same space for a while, it's also important to start checking in on how your fertility planning is going. Get a quick check every few years and see, like, is my organic matter growing or is it decreasing over the last 3 years of gardening? You should be hoping that it's actually growing. But it's really easy to find that your system is removing organic matter in the end. So it's good to just have a check of how you're moving through time. Some gardeners, especially who are doing a lot more gardening and are more reliant on their harvest, I would recommend testing yearly. But if this is something that you're starting out, you're still starting small, every few years is more than enough. I see a question about what about manure with hay, rabbit manure with hay? If you could clarify what your question is referring to, are you asking, about its usefulness or its nutritional quality? Just add a little to the chat, that would be great. So from here, we've kind of hit the end of the soils, and I want to talk about managing the garden itself, and those plants and how do we do the most that we can to help them thrive under stress? So some of the key strategies that organic gardens would be using would be crop rotation. I'll go into each of these a little bit more in the next few slides. Cover cropping and green manures, which I've brought up a couple times already. Supporting diversity, just doing what you can to be growing diverse things and allowing sort of native plants to exist around you. Adding compost whenever you can and other organic forms of organic matter, and just keeping an eye on your garden. Check on it often and see when things start changing. If you can catch changes early, that makes a big difference. So the goals from all of these strategies, what we think that what we often find we can kind of accomplish just with these strategies alone, is controlling insect pests and disease, managing weeds, managing nutrients, and building soil. Let's see. We have gotten a question about composting. Rob, I am going to hold off until I hit the compost point, and then we can answer. I just anticipate there being a lot of weird compost questions. I'm going to just push them all together if that's all right. So the big thing for crop rotation is that it's really beneficial if you can learn what the families are of the crops that you're growing. It is important to know like what a brassica is, and that's going to be knowing that very often broccoli and kale can pass diseases and pests to one another because they're effectively the same species, just presenting differently. It's important to know that leeks and onions are really closely related, so they can pass on pests and diseases. So paying attention to kind of who's related to whom, and therefore able to really share all of these problems that could build in your space, and rotating within your garden and not stacking those families on each other over and over again to build the problem up in that space. You also want to rotate between heavy and light feeding crops. Generally speaking, like a good guideline, heavy feeding crops are crops where you are harvesting the fruit. A tomato is a fruit. Botanically, it is a heavy feeder. Corn is producing seeds. It's a heavy feeder. Leafy greens, less so. Producing offspring and seed takes a lot of energy, and so they're taking a lot from the soil. The other thing about a lot of those fruits is they're going to be really specific about what micronutrients they really just drain the soil of. So tomatoes, for example, will take up a lot of calcium. So it's something to pay attention to. You wouldn't want to put tomatoes in the same place year after year. Heather, I see you asked, how can we learn about crop families and what pests and diseases they share? MOFGA's website, there are some fact sheets on pests and diseases, and they're going to tell you what all of the hosts are. So that's one quick, easy resource. I think I can also ask Anna, can I add links to this webinar afterwards? Like when this goes out, can we just drop a few extra resources in?
Yeah, we'll send a follow-up email and we could add in any links we desire.
Excellent. Sean, we've got a question. Is crop rotation and succession planting the same? Do you have to remove the whole plant before replacing with a new crop? So succession planting and crop rotation are not quite the same thing. Rotation is the idea that in 1 year and the next year, you would have a different shape to your plan of garden. So you wouldn't put tomatoes in the same exact corner of your garden 1 year and then the next year. Succession planting is the idea that, say, peas are really going to be an early crop and they are going to finish up before really the height of the summer. What are you going to plant in the space where you put peas when they start to decline? So that's within the same season. For crop rotation, it's important to think about if you're going to rotate on a 1 year basis. You put tomatoes in 1 year, you put squash in the next year, and then tomatoes and squash and tomatoes and squash. And yes, you're going to need to remove the whole plant because it'll take longer than a year for the pests and diseases that are living on the residue of that plant to actually be cleaned out of that garden as the plant residue is decomposed fully. If you are working on a rotation of 2, 3, 4 years, that's when it's actually beneficial to be able to leave a little bit more of that plant residue behind, in part because it's adding organic matter to that part of the garden to leave some root systems behind. There's sort of a third area of planting variety that's related to this, and that is interplanting. So what some people will do is, instead of waiting for the first crop to finish with the succession, knowing that seedlings often need a little bit of protection and shade, they'll plant those into and in between the preceding crop. In that case, you're assuming that they're kind of sharing space and sharing nutrients. When you pull out the older crop, it does make sense to leave a lot of that behind, especially the root systems. So you don't want to disturb the seedlings you've interplanted between them. Does that answer all those questions well? Good, great. And all of this, like how you decide to use all of that information, again, it's going to come back to your context. Like, what do you have time to think about? What do you have time to plan for? How much space do you have? How many crops are you really planning on growing? And if you've got one tomato plant, it's going to be a really different disease and pest pressure than if you've got a row of 20 plants that are all sharing one disease and pest pressure. So it's really going to be up to the context that you're living in. And that's going to be a little bit of just experimenting and learning. Another thing that I've discussed is cover cropping and green manure. So cover cropping, green manure, let's not focus too hard on that, but cover cropping is the idea that you would put plants in order to cover the soil and add richness and add diversity that are not meant to be harvested. So that is their whole goal, is simply to exist in that soil ecosystem and add something to it, depending on which cover crop you're choosing. So here I have some suggestions. You can choose buckwheat in the summer, field peas, oats and vetch in the spring, and oats in the fall. Those are like very easy, successful ones. Field peas are also a nitrogen fixer. Any legumes are going to fix nitrogen. So that's an additional benefit that you get out of some of these crops. You should do some research as you're picking cover crops to see what benefits do I want to get and how does that help me select a good cover crop. If you are going to be growing in your ground and you're breaking new ground, do consider cover cropping for a year or two before you start to grow vegetables in it. It will make that whole transition period so much easier for you. So really encourage that. And again, if you're going to do cover cropping and green manure, so much of the benefit to this is that you're leaving behind residue as organic matter. You're building the soil and letting it decompose in place. So this is not about cleaning the garden of cover crops when you're done. It's about finding a way to plant around them to the best of your ability while leaving as much plant matter in there as possible. Compost. Let's get back to this compost question. So we had a question also about, we'd like to add coffee grounds and wood ash to our composting versus directly into our garden. Depending on the pH of your soil, it would matter that the pH of your soil would matter a lot of whether or not you were going to put, for example, coffee grounds into your garden directly. If you need acidity, go ahead and throw some coffee grounds in there. But if you're concerned about acidity, it would be really important that you compost them first. So this is another case where it's up to your context. When you're thinking is to like come back to the basics of soil fertility and what affects that whole context, and do a little research on the materials you would like to add. Think about how that's going to fit into your whole context and system and soil ecology. Oh, I also missed a question. Can I test the soil myself, or do I need to hire someone? You cannot test the soil yourself. Even it's very difficult to get even the small bits of information, but some of the more critical pieces of information like lead content, it requires specialty equipment. So you are going to have to hire someone out. I could not figure out how to use that equipment in the whole 5 years I was in grad school. I dropped a whole research project so I wouldn't have to learn it. So no, I wouldn't recommend trying to do it on your own because it almost broke me. Let's see, is there anything else that I missed along the way?
Mary, you could you collect a soil
Yes.
sample?
You would collect your own soil sample for Maine, for the University of Maine. So the way that you would, that was a great question. Thank you for clarifying, Anna. If you do end up using the University of Maine soil testing, basically all collecting a soil sample for soil testing is the same anywhere. Any university pretty much has a YouTube video that you can pull up and watch about how to collect a really solid representative soil sample. And so what you'll do is read some of the instructions that come with the soil testing kit from UMaine. Maybe if you're still feeling a little uncertain, watch a few YouTube videos. They're very easy to find. And yeah, you'll collect it, bag it, send it off, and they will do the testing for you, and you'll get a result within a couple weeks. And the great thing about UMaine service is that, yes, there will be a lot of information that feels like, well, I didn't need all the chemistry here. But if you scoop down to the bottom of that report, they're going to make specific recommendations. And those recommendations will be, okay, well, if you are an organic gardener, this is an amendment that you might want to add. And this is the rate at which you might want to add it. So there's a recommendation for blood meal and how much you would want per square foot. So they're a really fantastic resource in that way. Yes, we've got some additional information. Yes, definitely reach out to Cooperative Extension if you would like a little bit more information on how to do a soil test and if you want the kit. As far as I know, carbon is the dry, but that the carbon and nitrogen titles for those two things are also not actually super descriptive of the real natural processes. It's just a good guideline that we use that tends to work well. So let's get to tips for compost. So the idea is that when you are building compost, you really want to have between 20 and 40 parts of what we'd call carbon source. So that's drier things like sticks, leaves, anything kind of, yeah, crumbly and dry that's not going to be as dense. And then about 1 part of nitrogen sources. So those are like generally wetter things, stinky things. Food scraps would be a good example. When doing that, those carbon sources are going to help make sure that the compost doesn't compact so much that there's no oxygen in there. Oxygen is really, really important to forming good, healthy, rich compost. In an anaerobic situation, you're just going to get fermented, basically gross vinegar, and it's going to smell like garbage. So you really want to get air into it. If your compost ever does start smelling rough, start flipping it, add oxygen, get it moving, and add some leaves, and that will almost certainly start to fix the problem. The other thing you're aiming for, and this is like a good check of like if your compost is doing well, the center should get to like, I would say at least 140. But 135 to 160 is about the range that you want to get to. Sean, it is by volume. And isn't that great? Because I would hate to have to weigh it. No, you can eyeball this. Yeah, so composting, you can treat it as an art or a science. It's really up to you. People get very deep into it. I tend to take an approach of if you don't need your compost to be done in a season, then it's much easier to kind of take a relaxed approach to it, sniff it, turn it, panic rarely. If you need your compost to be turning around every year, then yeah, you're going to be out there with a 3-foot long thermometer going, ooh, I'm getting good today, or you're going to be spraying it down with water. You probably don't need to worry about that. So there's good guidelines to follow to make good compost. Don't panic about it too much. I'm surprised I didn't get more compost questions. I usually do. Now that we're just talking about dealing with pests and diseases, I will come back to a quick question about neonics. Neonics or neonicotinoids are a class of pesticide that is based off of nicotine, neonicotinoid. So you can hear that in the name. There is very strong evidence that neonics persist in the environment in ways that affect pollinators, particularly native pollinators. Neonics are not OMRI approved. So if you were looking to maintain an organic garden, these wouldn't come up. So there probably isn't going to be an issue for any of you. There's very few neonics that are super available to home gardeners as well. They're primarily because they do have human toxicity. They're often requiring a pesticide applicator license. Are they a problem? Yes. Is it a choice that farmers are making? Almost never. We could talk about horizontal integration if you want, but you don't actually want me to get that nerdy. So let's talk about dealing with pests and diseases more broadly. So this is more where my expertise is. I have been working on invasive pests for the past few years. I was in an entomology department. So, you know, if you want to ask me bug questions, I've got answers for days. But in an organic system, what we're really going to focus on is trying to prevent and mitigate any pests and diseases. If we're accepting that our soil is a whole ecosystem with a lot of living things, some of those living things are going to share your love of your garden plants, and your goal is to just minimize them so you get what you want out of your garden and you find a good compromise on how much of it you're sharing with the world. Some of the ways, this is kind of a list of the main ways that we're going to focus in on as organic gardeners. We're going to try to keep our crops healthy. Healthy plants can defend themselves. They do not need all that much help from you. Neonics were developed from tobacco plants. There are other pesticides that are based off of caffeine. Plants make their own protective chemistry. We just need to give them enough health and strength and support to do that on their own well. It's also going to be important to time your planting. There's a lot of detail to that. What I would recommend is if you are concerned about a specific pest and timing, that's a good time to start looking through those fact sheets that we've linked in the chat here today, because those are going to give you a lot of information about when to be really focusing on protecting those plants. Sanitation. It is very easy, especially as a home gardener, to not think about how you move through the world with those tools, but the tools that you use, particularly anything that you're using to clip into a plant and cause a wound, might be carrying disease part, like microbes, to transmit disease between plants. So you do want to think about washing those just with dish soap occasionally. And particularly if you're starting to see disease outbreak, it's really important to be washing those more often. Physical barriers, that is primarily going to be talking about netting. So a lot of gardeners will use this. You might put a hoop over your plants and drape what's called insect netting over it. There are different weights of this depending on the pests that you're concerned about protecting from. And that's, again, things that you can learn about through fact sheets when you need to get into more specifics. They're often really reusable, especially if you're willing to do a little bit of patching and learn how to sew a bit. So yeah, physical barriers, netting, and especially in Maine where seasons are short, they can actually add a little bit of heat and help extend your season later. So there's a lot of benefits to using some physical barriers. Predators and parasites is about making sure that your diverse community around you is supporting other species of insects that might eat the insect pests that you were trying to battle. Rotation, again, is going to be really critical in not building up these problems. And the same thing is true with cover crops and weed control. Weeds are really good at supporting diseases that you aren't paying attention to. And then all of a sudden, they're able to transmit to plants in your garden that you're more concerned about. And then pesticides are always, 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 always your absolute last resort. There's no reason to use them unless you know that you're going to lose what is critical to you. Look for every other option before you move here. Part of that is because the problem will become larger later in many instances once you have taken this route. So avoid these wherever possible. The other thing is really important to note when you are looking for pesticides, just as I said a moment ago with neonics, a lot of these products are not available for home gardeners. So make sure that when you are looking for products, make sure that you have read the label and you know how to use them safely. Make sure that you are actually qualified to use them and you do not need a license. Just really read everything. And again, it's going to be the same label as it is for soil amendments, to look for organic certified or organic approved products to use in terms of pesticides. The big classes of pesticides that are organic approved are going to be insecticidal soaps, which disturb the waxes that help protect insects from drying out. Microbial insecticides, so that's going to pass a disease, often a fungal disease, to an insect so that they're battling illness and you don't have to battle them. And then there's botanical insecticides. So that's examples like knowing that plants are producing all of their own protective chemistry. There's a lot of insecticides that are based off of or extracted directly from botanicals. Neem oil is kind of the most common example of that. Are there benefits to interplanting vegetables with perennials? There are, and one benefit is just efficient use of space. But beyond that, it's going to be kind of the same benefits of interplanting in any case, right? So if you have a perennial that's going to be well established and give some shade cover, that's going to be a great place to put lettuce because it's going to protect that from scald. So it's perennialness is not what it is coming out to add something to your interplanting, but knowing more about those plants and what they need to thrive. There's definitely reasons to interplant with perennials. Yeah, the last things on this list for classes is copper and sulfur sprays. There's a note here that they're potentially toxic. They're not only potentially toxic to you, they are over time potentially toxic to the plants. So again, this is something where you really want to be careful about when and how you're using them and make sure you do a lot of reading before you make that call. Weed control, I'm just gonna remind you all, try to get your weeding done before things go to flower. Once things start flowering, you are building more seeds into your soil. You are just letting them leave some babies behind for next year. So if you can get them before they start to flower, your weed problem will start to go down over the years. But if you don't do that, you're going to be dealing with the same amount of weeds every year forever. So just think about catching them early every time that you can. Basic ways to keep weeds out. Mulching. You can use straw mulch or, other kind of natural mulches. If you get a much bigger garden and you're trying to get a big harvest, you can use plastic mulch. I don't think it's worth it for almost anybody. You really got to have some big goals. Cultivation and hand weeding, so just disturbing the soil and pulling up those weeds wherever you can. Cultivating in between your plantings, so that you're just disturbing any roots that are not the plants that you would like to be successful there. Interplanting can actually be really successful here too, because it gives you the opportunity to just take up more space before weeds start to.
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you mind if I interject a question that came to me privately?
Absolutely.
Before we move on from weeds. And it came in right before you're talking about mulching, so maybe this has been partially answered, but question is around the best way to mulch fast growing weeds in the garden.
Yeah, fast growing weeds are going to be tough. What I would recommend is, again, paying attention to how quickly you're catching them in any one season is going to save you so much grief in the next season. Another is mulch deep. Just make them work to get through. If it's really become a problem, I'd also recommend just using cardboard for a season as a layer before you add straw mulch or wood chips. Just that barrier is going to be much tougher for them to be successful through. And it's going to save you a little bit of grief, and it might help prevent things from getting all the way to flower so that you're starting to reduce that seed bank with just a heavier hit that year on mulching. This is the last of my slides. So we have a lot of time to ask some questions too. But the main takeaways here, plan. Don't forget what your goals are. Don't get lost in the weeds there. And don't forget your context. Don't give yourself challenges that are going to make gardening less fun. Nourish your soil communities and nourish your communities broadly. Nourish your communities because you're growing things and you get to share vegetables with your community. Pay attention to what your garden looks like and smells like every day. Every day that you've got time, go spend some time with it. Do some experimenting, learn from those experiments, and have fun. Yes, there is a seed exchange in Maine. Unfortunately, Rob, you missed it last week. MAFCA hosts a seed and scion exchange every year. But keep an eye out for next year's MAFCA seed and scion exchange. I've also had great success with Nextdoor, the neighborhood app on seed exchange. So you might want to check that out too. Kind of a goofy way to make it work, but it's something I've done in other states where there hasn't been as much seed swapping.
That's a good tip. And I'll just share, Rob, I'm not sure where you're located, but the seeds that are left over from our swap, which was just on Sunday, we share with the Resilience Hub. They're located in Portland, and they'll do another swap with those and anything else folks bring, which I believe they've scheduled for mid-April. I'll see if I can find the real date to share with you. Miriam, we got a question earlier about ledge. If there's hidden suspected ledge a few inches below the surface, how much soil do I need in a raised bed?
This is going to depend a lot on what you want to grow. There are some things that grow a little bit broader are going to be a lot easier for you to kind of get around. And things that grow a deep taproot and really need to be successful, it's going to be tougher. I think if you've only got, it depends, and also what is a few inches? What I would recommend is at least 10 inches you feel confident about, and probably just avoid any carrots that grow long. Grow some French carrots if you're going to grow carrots. 10 inches of soil is kind of the minimum you'll need. Buying seeds. So it depends on, I'm always going to say it depends. Tell me more about what kind of seeds you want. I love a lot of places. I love True Love Seeds is a place where you can get some culturally appropriate seeds. So I have found a squash that I haven't had in, I don't know, 15 years, that my family used to grow in Syria and I just haven't had access to. So that's a lovely way to try new things. And other than that, there's a lot of great organic seed sources. I know a lot of people in this area use Fedco. I know a lot of people use High Mowing. And of course, a ton use Johnny's, and you can just select for organic seeds. Particularly what variety you're going to decide on, use the same parameters that you would use to pick a crop to grow. What are you going to enjoy of all of these varieties? Really read through seed catalogs in depth and get all of the information that you can about a variety before you try it out and know if it's going to work in your context. Thanks, Anna. I hope that answers questions. Starting with raw forested land, we're going to remove some trees. Long process is basically what my advice would be. Except that it's going to be a long process, and give yourself more time than you think you want to. The longer you give yourself, the easier it is going to be in that first year of trying to garden. But there's also definitely some plants that do better or worse in that kind of context. And I would really encourage you to start with leafy greens in your first couple of years. When can you plant seeds? I would recommend turning back to the seed calendar that Anna had shared. This has been it's a pretty good, successful one. Obviously, there's a lot of local variety, so you do have to pay attention to when your frost dates are going to be, but it's even finer grain than sort of what
looking for someone.
Oh, I don't know. I'm gonna keep going, and Heather will add some more if she would like to. Pay attention to much more local information than even what your local weather station is giving you. So if you know that you have a dip in your property, that dip is probably going to be colder than other places on your property, and it's going to be more likely to freeze. So if you're right on the edge of freezing, that particular piece of your land might be more likely to freeze. I love that it was a cat. That makes so much sense and is beautiful. I love that we are all getting a little bit of help in this gardening journey from our cats. Yeah, so definitely pay attention to your frost experiences where you are. And if you get nervous and you're not sure and you've put something in the ground, cover it. Other questions? Happy to take some, not only in the chat, but by voice if anybody would like to. Just go ahead and raise your hand and we can Easiest starter veggies. Again, I'm gonna say it's the same advice. Like leafy greens are always like they're gonna be your easiest. If you want to go with like microgreens, baby kale, great. It's gonna be easiest. Unless you don't care about them. And then they'll become suddenly very difficult. So easiest is relative to your interest in eating them, is my experience. Peas are also a good one because they're pretty. Feel like they've got the good aesthetics thing going for them. It's a little easier to pay attention. Cold frames versus tents. Are we thinking about for hardening off? This is something I didn't bring up, so maybe that's a good opportunity. So hardening off is if you did start seeds inside, if they are not used to being outside, they're not going to thrive when you transplant them. So in between starting a seed and getting it in the ground, it's important to give it a little bit of time where it's adjusting, where your seedlings are adjusting to outdoor conditions. So what a cold frame or a tent can do is give you the opportunity to put them outside and make them give them a more protected place to be. But those tents and cold frames also open up so that when you do get to a little bit of a warmer day, you can give them a little bit more air. So it's a little bit, you can give them a couple weeks to kind of adjust. How long it takes to harden off, what are the good choices for hardening off are a little bit plant specific. So definitely do a little research while you're figuring out what your hardening off plan is. In terms of cold frames versus tents, my honest answer is if you plan on sticking around and you've got the money to put in a cold frame, that's great because they're going to last longer. But if you're not going to live in that place for a really long time and it's too big of an investment, go for a tent. It's kind of going to be up to how many starts you really need to harden off in a season and what your space and time and money constraints are. I use a tent again because I'm renting and I don't know how long we'll be here. So it doesn't make sense to put in anything permanent. Does that kind of, I think that answers that question. Let's see, what type of different plants would be good to include in a garden to encourage a population of beneficial insect predators and parasitoids to control pests? That is a broad question, but there's a pretty solid answer for it, which is definitely plant diversely. Plant some flowers if you are growing vegetables. Flowers attract, blooms will attract a lot of those beneficials to your garden. And when you're thinking about what flowers to plant, consider how to make sure that you have the largest portion of your time with blooms open. I think that answers that question. I think about it. Yeah. Is there a proper time to release nematodes? There's a few different kinds of nematodes, and there's a few reasons that you might release them. Yes, there's a proper time to release them. Each nematode species is going to be a different answer. They do not last all that long though, so timing is really important. So if you are choosing to release nematodes, definitely read about the nematodes you're buying and use some fact sheets to support your decision making about timing for the pests that you're targeting. You know, I have to be honest with you, Rob. I have no feelings about farming worms or using worm castings. I wish I had more, but I don't have any feelings about them. It's good to encourage worms to be in your compost, and if they're there, that's great. You're doing great. It feels to me like it's more work than it's worth and more worry than it's worth when you could probably just encourage worms without as much focus. Hope that helps. We have an issue with cutworms destroying our young chard. Options to get rid of them. Get rid of them, difficult. Avoid them, easier. I'm just gonna recommend a fact sheet actually on cutworms, because there's a lot of ideas that could be useful. And do you think you're like, oh, look at you go. Here you go. Anna is coming in so quickly with all of these fact sheets. Yeah, definitely turn to this fact sheet. There's a lot of different options, but cultural ones are often the most effective in an organic system. So think about, depending on the crop that you're working with, when do you want to put it in? How do you want to protect it? And consider actually physically protecting your seedlings until they're grown up enough. But this is one where, again, the stronger your plant is going to be, the easier it is for it to avoid cutworms. Is it recommended to start out growing herbs indoors as seedlings when I start growing medicinal and cooking herbs? It depends on the herb. I can tell you, like basil, for example, absolutely you need to start it. You cannot direct seed it. And even when you start it, you're going to get like a 20% success rate of those starts. So plant way more than you want. I personally, because herbs, I want 1 or 2 plants and the seeds come in 200 seed packets. I buy starts. And I find that really has been successful for me. I will often plant my herbs in containers, even when I do have access to a raised bed or full garden, because I do like to season extend just by pulling them inside. Rosemary, for example, you can really keep pretty much year round if you'd like to in a pot. They do pretty well as an indoor house plant effectively. So depends on the herb. Depends seems to be, once again, my answer to everything. But there are also really great ways to just be growing year-round indoors with herbs. And if that's something that fits into your life better than an outdoor garden, like, it's a great way that I really suggest to a lot of people who don't have access to any outdoor space that they can call their own and are maybe on a wait list still for a community garden. Also going to just throw out there, if you are starting seeds inside, you do not need a grow light. If you are growing plants inside, you might need a grow light. If you're just starting seeds inside, any LED bulb will be great. You'll be fine. They don't need that much. Yeah, so quick. Amazing.
I practice on I'll plug an event while they're coming up. Our coworker Miriam's and my coworker Caleb and I throughout the year host gardening Q&As, and you can bring your gardening questions, and we put Caleb in the hot seat, and he answers as many as he can during the hour. And I got fast in finding those fact sheets doing this, so that's where that comes from.
Amazing. Amazing. Takes me longer when I'm trying to write an email to find one of these fact sheets. I'm so impressed.
And since I was plugging, I'll just put in the chat, everybody, our event calendar, in case you want to join us for other webinars or in-person events throughout the season.
Well, it was lovely to have all of you. Thank you all for your questions. It's been fantastic. And I love talking about people's gardens, so I'm having a great time. Thank you.